Welcome everyone to this evening's presentation and panel discussion. My name is Lynn. I'm the director of the museum here at Röhsska, and it's my great pleasure to, of course, wish you all welcome, but a special welcome to also today's presenters, Dr. Lynn, who we will soon meet, and also Lynn, who is the moderator of today, and even Gunnar Adelius, who is the director of the Swedish Museums Association. So on with tonight's program, which is a collaboration with the Association of Swedish Museums and with Lynn. And Lynn and Gunnar will soon come up and talk a little bit more about this series of seminars that are taking a tour around Sweden with other international speakers, apart from you, Dr. Lynn. And today's format will be done in such a way that Dr. Lynn will present her museum to us, which will then lead us to a panel discussion which Maria will moderate, and both Dr. Lynn and myself will take part in that conversation. And from that, we are also opening up the floor for questions that you may have along the way. But before I invite Maria and Gunnar onto the stage, I also wanted to share Lynn's a short version of her CV, because it's rather long, but I'll try and summarize it fairly. So Lynn is curator and writer and educator from Stockholm, and since 2023 she is the director of the Kin Museum of Contemporary Art in Kiruna. From 2020 to 2023 she served as the Council of Culture at the Embassy of Sweden in Moscow. And prior to that, she was the director of Stockholm's Torsdag, the artistic director of the Gwangju Biennale, the director of the graduate program at the Center of Curatorial Studies at Bard College in the States, and the director of Jaspers Stockholm at least once, I believe, and the director of Kunstverein München in Munich. And for over 3 decades, Lynn has developed a distinct curatorial methodology that is art-centered, process-orientated, and context-sensitive. She expresses a strong belief in art as a form of understanding the complexity of life on par with science, politics, and religion. She has often brought attention to lesser-known artists and practices, including social practice, collective work, and research-based art, anticipating their later acknowledgement in the field of art. So, on that note, I would like to invite you up, Maria, and also Gunnar, who will speak briefly about the seminar series. Thank you.
Warm welcome to you, Victoria. Just a few words about the Swedish Museums Association in Swedish. Gunnar Lynns heter jag, generalsekreterare på Sveriges Museer. Vi anordnar den här samtalsserien som har pågått under hösten och som kommer att fortsätta under 2026. Och Maria, du ska berätta lite mer om den sen. Jag kan berätta varför vi gör den. Sveriges Museer, vi har 280 museer som medlemmar, vi är branschorganisation för museerna. Och vi har en hel del väldigt spännande konstmuseer. Bara Kin är ett, där händer väldigt mycket. Och sättet som man arbetar med konst på konstmuseerna och samtidskonst, det är ofta samtidens mest brännande frågor. Man behöver ofta tänka nytt och annorlunda, och det vill vi också att ska rinna över på våra övriga medlemmar. Så att vi gör det här också för att hela museet Sverige ska kunna få ett wake-up call helt enkelt.
Tack så mycket, Gunnar. My name is Lynn, and I'm so happy that we have been able to do this collaboration with Sveriges Museer. So 5 seminars over the course of almost 1 year, each taking place at a different museum in Sweden, and each also inviting a speaker, a curator from elsewhere, with a practice that is known to take new grips on what it means to work with contemporary art in various ways. So last time, the first seminar happened at the Kin Museum of Contemporary Art in Kiruna, where I'm the director, and we had Jagna Lewandowski from the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw speak about their practice, which has been influential in terms of urban development in Warsaw, as well as in terms of what type of work is presented in the context of a major museum in a capital. We will go on after this seminar at Röhsska to Silvermuseet in Arjeplog, a jewel in Norrbotten, where Manolo Borja Vilel, legendary director of the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Spain, in Madrid, Reina Sofia, to speak about decolonial practices as he's been doing them at that museum, but also across the museums in Catalonia. And that's the fourth one. The third one is at Arbetet in Stockholm with Tone Hansen from the Munch Museum, which has taken a new direction with its new building, but also with her directorship in terms of engaging differently with the legacy of a world-famous artist, as well as bringing in contemporary art. And the final, fifth one, will be at Etnografiska Museet in Stockholm with Doreen Mende, who's the head of the research department at the umbrella organization Staatliche Kunstsammlungen Dresden, the state collections of Dresden, which is covering more than a dozen different museums and collections in Saxonia in Germany. And she will speak about the very inventive way of thinking through artistic research in relation to colonial legacies at those museums. And they are absolutely full of objects robbed and in other ways brought from different parts of the world to Germany. But today we have Victoria Lynn, a fantastic curator and museum director coming here all the way from Narm, more known as Melbourne in Australia. And the reason for inviting you, Victoria, is among other things, the way you have been incorporating the meaning, the significance of a place, both historically and culturally, and how you have consistently been able to work outside the box, I would say, with the curatorial co-creation in different ways, and also constantly involving thinking about art in society, not as separate from society. And the place that you're currently directing, the TarraWarra Museum, which we will hear lots more about, is a privately founded and partly privately funded museum, about an hour outside of Narm, and it has possibly the most beautiful poetic museum name that we can imagine. TarraWarra actually means slowly flowing water, långsamt rinnande vatten. And the way you're working with the collection, which is modern and contemporary, and also with artists who are alive and active today, is inspiring. And I would now like to give the floor to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for coming. I'd like to also take this opportunity to thank Röhsska Museum, Nina, the Swedish Museums Association, Una, and of course Maria Lynn from the Kim Museum for this invitation. It's an honour to be part of the series. This talk is really about living in a settler colonial country, Australia, where there are many worlds that coexist. And I'm going to focus on the world of First Nations people and artists and how we've developed ways of working with them and their history. If I were in Australia, I would be doing an acknowledgement of country, and I'll explain that as we go. And I would also say that I am a settler Australian, with my ancestry dating back on one side to an Irish convict, and on the other side to the Ukraine and Germany. My mother was an immigrant from a family that experienced enormous upheaval during the Second World War, and I now realise that has really underpinned my curiosity about artists from diverse places and backgrounds. So TarraWarra Museum of Art is located on what we call Wurundjeri country, the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. It's approximately an hour outside the city of Melbourne or Naarm. It opened in 2003 and was designed by the Australian architect Alan Powell. It exhibits modern and contemporary Australian art along with contemporary international art. And unlike many museums that are regional in Australia, we're not located in a town, but we're nestled into an area of vineyards and farmland. And I mention this because a visit to TarraWarra is more than one experience. It's the experience of what is on the walls inside the museum, but it's also the experience of the changing nature of the terrain outside. So the building was a gift of Eva and Mark Beeson, our founding patrons, who collected art over a 70-year period, and they decided in 1999 to gift their collection and the museum to the people of Australia, and we can talk a little bit more about the governance a little bit later. It was designed in the tradition of a white modernist cube, a 20th century Western ideology and architectural form that sought to separate art from its outside. And the building also offers these incredible threshold experiences with the views around it, framed by windows and the courtyard architecture, as if it too is a painting. So when I started at the museum, I really wanted to deconstruct that view and pursue a site-responsive approach that over time has opened the museum to the worlds that artists participate in and create. We've recently opened a second building, which has been named after our patrons Eva and Mark Beeson, designed by Kirsten Thompson Architects. It's already won 2 or 3 awards, and it houses the collection in an open storage facility, so it's visible, and a multi-purpose learning and performance space. We engaged landscape architects Oculus, and it was very important for us for them to work with local First Nations voices. So we worked with Craig Murphy-Wandon, who was a horticulturalist and an artist, and he designed the Indigenous and Native garden. And the visible storage shows over 400 works from the collection. And this is an image of the opening ceremony with Uncle Dave, who will feature soon, doing a smoking ceremony. As we've heard, TarraWarra is a Woiwurrung language word. It's the name of the locality. Actually, next door to us is the TarraWarra Abbey. In Woiwurrung, it's been translated as slow-moving or slow-flowing water. And the architects took inspiration from this idea and have created a way of capturing the water from rain and allowing it to flow over the top of the building and get recirculated through the space onto a rock that came from the ground that the museum was made from. So we kept a number of boulders, which was a request of one of the elders of the Wurundjeri people, and Craig carved it out and created this space for the water to flow into. So we see the native and Indigenous garden as a space of welcome. We don't need to have a plaque that says you're located on Wurundjeri country. The garden is the plaque. Inside, we have a collection from the 1930s to the present day. We show Australian mid-century modernism, contemporary art. The collection is mainly landscape art, abstraction, art around the figure. There's some names on the screen of some of our prominent Australian artists who may not be well known over here. Since the museum opened, we've started a collection of First Nations art as well. And our collection policy, like our name, is slow collecting. So we only collect things very occasionally. So inside is this 46-metre glass wall that people can freely walk down, and we provide information and notes on what they can see, or they can come back of house and we provide tours of the 64 screens and 400 works that are on display. And this is the multi-purpose space where we put on workshops, performance, music and education. So the goals of the museum are listed here. We want to connect art, place and ideas. So place is very formative for us. We obviously involved with audience engagement. We like to collaborate with the sector, and we want to provide robust, sustainable and secure operations. We have a very active learning and engagement program, schools access program, where we bring in students from disadvantaged schools and provide free buses. We work with First Nations groups, tours, workshops, family activities and online resources. And I would say the exhibition program has 3 themes. A site-responsive approach, which is the theme I'm going to discuss today, art as a world-making activity, and shining a new light on the collection. And the artistic experiences are multiple. There's visible art storage, there's exhibitions, programs and events, there's outdoor sculptures, the architecture of course, and the grounds and the surrounds. So I've used the term curatorial co-belonging in the title of this lecture. And these are some of the reasons why. We're located on Wurundjeri country, and the Wurundjeri history and custodianship of the area has been an important springboard for a site-responsive approach. There was an Aboriginal station nearby the museum between 1863 and 1924. This is when a number of communities, Indigenous communities in Victoria, petitioned the government for a safe place to live and work. And it's now run by the Wurundjeri Estate Aboriginal Corporation, with whom we have a memorandum of understanding. So to be culturally attuned to locality and situation and a First Nations history counters the Western epistemological approach to the modern art museum. It takes a lot of work, as you'll see, and I'm just going to focus on a couple of projects that demonstrate how we try to co-belong with that community. We're not managing them or curating them, we're co-belonging on the landscape together. So I see curatorial co-belonging as something that is not cut off from life, but connected to the site of the exhibition, along with multiple and changing histories, places, events, and situations. This is the Birra, also known as the Yarra River, which flows past the museum, and is the reason Auntie Joy Murphy Wanden thinks that the area is called TarraWarra, because it winds quite a bit in that area and the water slows down. So what is a view? What is a point of view? What is a landscape? Who owns the view? Who owns country? And country is a concept that First Peoples in Australia use that express their ancestral connections, their economic connections, their cultural connections, and the 65,000 years of living on and in the Australian landscape. So this is a map showing all of the language groups that existed in Australia before colonisation. First Peoples have lived continuously in Australia for 65,000 years. This is the oldest continuous Indigenous peoples in the world. And prior to colonisation, there were 250 languages spoken, approximately 38 in Victoria. Some of these had several varieties, so there were about 500 language varieties across Australia. This is a map of Victoria, the state where we're located, and you can see the 38 languages, and I will just, I will just point out there Wurundjeri-folkets, which is the language group that we're dealing with. And this is an indicative location of the Aboriginal mission stations that existed after colonisation. And here you see Coranderrk, and here is Melbourne. And our museum is right next to Coranderrk. Some of you may have heard about some of the ways in which Australians have mistreated First Nations communities. The first European settlement in Victoria was 1803, and settlers began arriving in 1835. They decimated the Aboriginal population. There were massacres, there was the introduction of disease and the taking of land, and the beginning of sheep farming and cattle farming also decimated the soil. Coranderrk Aboriginal Station was established in 1863, and within 10 years it was self-sufficient. It had a school, a church, kitchen, laundry, dairy, a hops farm, crops, an orchard, brick kilns, cattle, and a sawmill. And it was closed by the government in 1924. In the 1990s, 200 acres was returned to the families who proudly manage it as a centre now for learning and engagement. In 2023, the Australian government asked the people of Australia to change our constitution and allow for a First Peoples voice to Parliament. This would be an advisory panel that would be in the constitution no matter who was in government. It was rejected by the people of Australia. It was a referendum, and we have compulsory voting, and it caused great harm and distress. However, on a good note, Australia's first statewide treaty with its First Peoples came into law in Victoria on November 13 this year, and we now have in Victoria a permanent First Peoples representative body to advise government. So I just want to show a video here because I feel it's important for you to hear firsthand from a First Nations person who's been instrumental in helping us at TarraWarra, Uncle Dave Wandon.
My name is Dave Wandon, and I'm an elder of the Wurundjeri-folkets Tribal Land Council, but also on the board of directors here at what is left of Coranderrk Station. And I'm here to talk to you about the history of Coranderrk and what it means, not only in today's context, but what it means to me as an Aboriginal person. Coranderrk was set up in 1863 as a mission station after many failed attempts of finding suitable land for my ancestors. When they were walking back to Parliament House to look for new land, as they came over what is now known as the Black Spur, they looked over this beautiful valley. They said, this is the place that we want. And that's where the story of Coranderrk begins. Because it wasn't something that was set aside by the government. It wasn't chosen by the government, it was chosen by our people. It was in actual fact the first land rights claim in Australia. Now, although it wasn't a native title land claim, it was a legislation set down by the government of the day that 4,800 acres of this land be set aside for my ancestors and many ancestors of other Aboriginal mobs in perpetuity. Of course, that means forever, but unfortunately nothing is forever. The idea of mission stations was to actually allow our people to die out. My people, in particular Simon Wonga, William Barrack, and the Aboriginal Superintendent, John Green, actually made this place successful, and they made it a thriving community. And it was sustainable, and they cared for themselves. They grew many foods here, and in fact behind us, that hillside was all covered with vegetables. They ran their own cattle, pigs, chooks. They grew potatoes, corn, cabbages, whatever was available in the modern world. Because it was so successful though, people said it was too good for Aboriginal people. There was a famous inquiry held here into the state of Aboriginal people in Victoria, of which William Barrack was very influential. Unfortunately, it was a battle that was lost. So by the end of 1924, the land had all been carved up and our people were moved off to Lake Tyers, which is the last remaining mission still that's in existence today, but it's not a mission. It's actually run by Aboriginal people for Aboriginal people. And I'm standing here in front of the remaining building that was left on this place when it was carved up and sold off to early settlers. And it's where everybody, when they come here, they all want to see the house. It's a 2-storey, 11-room house. This house was built by my ancestors. The bricks were actually, the clay was quarried off this property and they were fired in a purposely built brick kiln to erect this house. So that's why it's important as a historical thing. What I see though, is it's the only building that remains. All the other buildings that my ancestors built were all torn down. So the thing was, when they closed this place down, they wanted to remove all evidence that it actually existed, and they left this monument behind. Now, we do have our elders living in this house, or one elder and his partner, so we've claimed it back.
The following images are being shown with the permission of Auntie Joy Murphy-Wandon, AO, Senior Elder of the Wurundjeri people. They're from the pictures collection at the State Library of Victoria, and if there are any First Nations Australian people watching this video, please be aware that some of these images depict persons who are now deceased. So this is what Coranderrk looked like in the early days, and I'm just going to flick through some of these images. Fred Kruger took a number of photographs at the station. You can see here the First Nations people are dressed in Victorian wear and they're posing as if they're fishing by the river. And we invited the artist Daniel Boyd, who is a First Nations artist, to come and do a work for one of our biennials. And he took this image and reproduced it in charcoal and covered it with these archival glue dots that he uses, as if to ask us to have another look at the image, see what's wrong with it, and also to kind of reclaim the image through his own gesture. This is an image of one of the hops farms. This is an image of the elders who petitioned the government about their conditions. William Barrack with the white beard and Simon Wonga next to him. And here's the image of the house that was built for the superintendent. And these are some of the works that were made on site. Granny Jemima Burns-Wandon Donnelly's basket and William Barrack's beautiful parrying shield and one of his paintings. And these works are now held in museums in Melbourne. And descendants of these artists, these ancestors, continue to make contemporary work. This is a work by Kim Wandon, who lives in the small town Hillsville, where the museum is nearby, and she's using traditional weaving techniques to make an eel trap. This is actually how they fished. They put these eel traps in the water to catch the eels. So how do I, as a museum curator and director, reconcile the establishment of this modern art museum in 2003 on land that was stolen from people in 1788? It's a very difficult question. Some of you will know the notion of the curatorial, which our colleague Maria Lynn identified many, many years ago. Art practice that is sensitive to its site and its context, that encourages audiences to think from the work, away from it or against it. And co-belonging, which I've joined into that through fragmentation, montage, assemblage, artists and exhibitions that can consider the archives and the lack of lack of evidence in these archives as a call to audiences to belong in the world in a different way. It's a call on our audiences to be more ethically driven. And it's a term I've borrowed from Jacques Rancière. And I think that the word co-belonging holds within it three main dimensions. One is the hyphen in the word, and that is a generative space. When you have a juxtaposition of settler country and First Nations knowledge, there is a hyphen, there is a cleavage, but it can also be generative. Then this idea of belonging, who belongs? And belonging to what? And who or what do we intermingle with? And then familiarity, things belong together. And in my view, it's the First Nations curators in Australia and the First Nations artists who get to do that and decide what belongs with what. So art can be seen as a mode of co-belonging, creating connections across time, between histories, places, events and situations, to cohabit, to be co-present. This is a project we did, we launched in 2019, untitled 7 Monuments. It was an idea that was brought to us by Auntie Joy Murphy-Wandin, Jonathan Jones, who's a Kamilaroi and Wurundjeri artist, and Tom Nicholson, who's a settler artist. It consists of 7 small monuments, and they're located at points when Coranderrk was at its largest, over 4,000 acres. The monuments consist of a flagpole that's been buried in the earth. So the flagpole, which is normally the symbol of conquest and ownership of land, has been buried by the artists. And it's a reminder to current local inhabitants of Healesville and Badger Creek that their land was once an Aboriginal station. It took 6 years for us to negotiate this work because there were 7 different landowners. Some communities didn't want it in their street, and it involved a process of deep listening on behalf of the museum and the community, and a process of learning about cultural protocols, about the impact of past injustices, and being sensitive to the Wurundjeri people's feelings, and understanding that there really was a dearth of information about First Nations histories in the region. There's 7 permanent sites marking the border of Coranderrk Aboriginal Station in 1866. The small cairn of bricks, the bricks were all donated by residents of Healesville, and the bronze plaques feature on one side a map and a description on another side of the 7 Wurundjeri seasons. So there are not 4 seasons in Wurundjeri beliefs, there's 7. And here you can see in the brochure the connection that the artists made between a tree that sends its roots underground and the design of the 7 monuments itself. So it's now owned by under the custodianship, I should say, of the local council, and each monument also has what we know as Christmas bush, but what is actually called Coranderrk, which is a bush that flowers at Christmas. And I think that the artists and us really were very proud of this project because the buried flagpole turns the colonial claim to land on its head, thereby negating it. They're markers in the landscape, and it's a landscape that's been scarred by colonisation, and we're just very proud that it still exists today. This is a smoking ceremony at the opening. In a smoking ceremony, they would say Wamajika, which means welcome, but it also means come with purpose. The eucalypt leaves are burnt to a point where they emit a lot of smoke, which has healing qualities, and the elder will invite everybody present to bathe themselves in the smoke in order to feel both welcomed and to heal. So the idea of belonging was something that we did in another project called the Soils Project, which was interrupted by the pandemic, and so, as Charles Escher joked, it's taking longer than Documenta to create this project. 2 webinars, an international in-person workshop, an exhibition at TarraWarra and an exhibition at Wurundjeri-folkets Museum. We worked with a group of Indonesian curators and artists and activists who work on land sovereignty in Indonesia. So the Dutch, the Indonesians, the Australians all have experienced the woes of colonisation, and we decided as a group to choose the metaphor of soil. Soil is actually living, it's a living body of knowledge. It's also a metaphor, and everybody can relate to soil. There's good soil, there's sandy soil, there's seaside soil, there's great soil for agriculture. Everyone has a story about soil. And Munir Faché has said that there are 4 kinds of soil. There's the earth soil, the material of soil. There's cultural soil. Soil has cultural value for so many communities. There's communal soil. Soil is a place where communities come together. And there's affection, spiritual soil. Soil is something that can be used in ritual and in belief systems. We wanted a non-extractive approach. I live in a country with a great deal of mining, and we wanted to be very sensitive to the soil itself. We were aware that we were decolonising, but in the context in Australia, we tend to use the word indigenising the museum. It's a process, it's not something that's ever complete. We worked with a form of care. We had kinship with and care of the earth in our minds. And we involved communities and artists from the very beginning. So the very first webinar, we had fellow travellers, we called them, who helped us develop the themes for this project. 2 communities from Indonesia, from Central Sulawesi and Kalimantan, and of course I brought in the Wurundjeri Estate Aboriginal Corporation. We agreed with Arturo Escobar's notion of a pluriversal world, that the world consists of interwoven threads, always in motion, always changing. We acknowledge that many of the people we were working with believe that humans and non-human matter can coexist. We also looked at the link between colonisation and climate change. You don't have to go very far down into the soil in Australia to get to a pre-colonial layer. And it was a tricky project because we were reframing the history of our own museum. We were acknowledging our role and our privilege in that process, and we were also working on a process of dispersed curating. I want to talk about a couple of the pieces. This is a postcard by Nicholas Kerr that was taken off the Birrarung, the Yarra River, down behind the museum in the 1880s to 1900s. He hand-painted it, and it was reproduced as a postcard. This is a postcard that the Yorta Yorta artist Peter Clancy turned into wallpaper. So you see the mountain in the distance there, and then in the wallpaper you can see the mountain in the corner there. What she does is goes back onto country. She found the location and she rephotographed it. Then she takes the large photographs that she's made back down onto country. She cuts sections out and she photographs it again. And through this process, she discusses that she's trying to kind of reconnect with country and bring an Indigenous voice to that landscape. So a lot of these projects involve an enormous amount of research, and here there's an image of Peter Clancy taking the photograph. There I am with Dee Harding, Brooke London, who is from the local community and an artist, and Peter Clancy himself. And I think this kind of activity does take a lot of research, it does take a lot of time working with the artists and experiencing their research and their discoveries with them in order to develop solid understandings of what they're trying to do. I've just got a little image there of a little bit of resin that's leaked out of what's called an acacia tree. It's also known as gum arabic, a binder that's used in paint. But it's something that First Nations people would have used to bind clay or ochre in making things. And that leads me to the work of Dee Harding, who worked with Brooke and her family to find these incredible ochres on local land. Now, I wasn't part of that process because some things are secret and sacred. So they didn't want me to know where they got these ochres from. And I was astounded at the different colours. And Dee Harding's notion is that the colour of the soil can signal place. It can signal where somebody is from and where they belong. So they created these large works on paper and then brought them into the museum. They're suspended up high, and when the light shines on them, they cast the most beautiful coloured shadows into the space of the museum. And then taking a wet cloth, they lift some of the ochre off the paper and they covered the windows. Why did they cover the windows? Whose view is it? Who owns the view? So Dee covered the windows to such an extent that no one would be able to see out. And he covered it to his height, which is about 2 metres. And then he invited Brooke Wanden to create a gap at her eye level. So therefore we have the perspective of 2 First Nations artists on our window, on our view, our much loved view in the museum, to, in a sense, take back ownership of that view and ask who owns the view. There were other works in the exhibition. Brooke Wanden worked with Megan Cope on a digital print of the whole horizon that surrounded the museum. Megan Cope worked with Ken D'Souza, creating a series of soil drawings on chromatography paper. And I've got 2 close-ups here. So the chromatography paper, they drip a little bit of soil in water onto the paper, it separates out, and then a soil scientist will be able to tell what the properties of that soil are. But here they went around Coranderrk with permission of the elders and labelled which soil sample was from which area. And they imagined what was there before, because everything's gone. So they imagined where the houses were, they imagined where the schoolhouse was. And again, this involved quite a lot of work, walking around Coranderrk, spending a day digging down to the pre-colonial soils, and working with a soil scientist, Dr Samantha Grover, from a local university. And the Indonesians brought paintings in the shape of ovariums, they called them, or ovaries, women's reproduction, using seeds, rice, plants, bark, all kinds of matter and material which was sealed within resin. And when I asked them why they chose this ovarium image, they just said, if the forest dies, women can't reproduce. For them, it was just a direct connection. And the forest is dying in Indonesia because of the palm oil plantations, which are a monoculture, and they're taking over and changing the nature of the soil itself. And on the opening weekend, we used the ochre that Dee and Brooke had collected from country, and we did a collective painting, a collective ovarium painting, which was then gifted to Wandun Estate. What was really touching was seeing how there were so many correspondences between the community, from Sulawesi and Kalimantan and what Uncle Dave and others were experiencing in Australia, it really affected everybody quite deeply. And you can see in the background there a map that Uni Sadaraya and her community did of the palm oil plantations in her area, which are a threat to traditional farming techniques. So what does it mean then when things belong together? We have a biennial at the museum, and it's a different guest curator every year. And this year we invited Yorta curator Kimberly Moulton to curate the exhibition. She's also the Indigenous curator for the Tate Modern in London, and she used to work at Melbourne Museum for 14 years. So the title "We Are Eagles" comes from a statement that had been made by Sir Doug Nicholls in 1938. He said, "We do not want chicken feed. We are not chickens, we are eagles." Eagle is a very important spirit figure for Wurundjeri people. We often see the eagle flying above the museum. They call him Bunjil. He is a creator spirit, and he's often accompanied by 2 black crows who are called Wa. And I think what Kimberly was trying to do with this exhibition, without trying to speak too much on her behalf, was to talk about the cultural strength and power of art and of objects, historical objects, to acknowledge ancestral knowledge, to renew memory, cultural material and place, to disrupt coloniality, to acknowledge that there are multiple truths, and to give the artists an opportunity for self-determination. The exhibition did not solely focus on First Nations artists. It also had artists with deep ancestral histories in Thailand, the Pacific Islands, the Middle East and elsewhere. So she talks about restoring the spirit back to a collection. And she says that spirit is linked to country. It is a multiverse. A spirit is the people, the sky, the earth, the water, country, cultural belongings and language. So she focused on this little boomerang, which was in the collection of Melbourne Museum. It's a child's boomerang. And after extensive research, she found that it was discovered in a park in Melbourne in 1920. There was a human zoo in that park in 1888 that the vice chairman of the Zoological Society had set up. And through photographs, Kimberly has worked out that people from Coranderrk were in the human zoo. So it could be that the boomerang actually did come from Coranderrk. It's very distressing material to have to deal with. So she invited Brooke London to create a work with the boomerang. So Brooke went to the Aboriginal communities in Victoria and asked them how to say child's boomerang, and has written up those words on the yellow wall. And then Brooke just wove companions for the boomerang, for the baby boomerang. She said, "I just wanted to create a family for it. Friends, love it up and care for it." So that was the entrance to the exhibition. Indigenous people want to tell their own stories, write their own versions in their own ways, for their own purposes. It's not simply about giving an oral account or a genealogical naming of the land and the events, but a very powerful need to restore a spirit, to bring back into existence a world fragmented and dying. This is one of the quotes in Kimberly's essay for the catalogue. So, land and soil are living archives, and the boomerang was under layers of soil. We have to listen to country, and we have to learn how to co-belong with these objects and histories, no matter how distressing they are. So this is a stream that's been right through our exhibitions at TarraWarra. This was the final moment of a performance in 2023 by Unbound Collective, a group of incredible women from Adelaide, and the exhibition was entitled Ua Usi Usi Fa'ava Asavili, a Samoan proverb which means the canoe obeys the wind. The exhibition is created by Leoi Eshragi. So when I arrived at TarraWarra, I was curious to understand the view, conceptually, to unravel its history and encourage audiences to think with care for country. And I hoped our audiences would see the landscape awry through the diverse lens of a range of artists. So these projects I've mentioned today have been driven by several of my team, past and present at the museum, and have really been shaped by the enormous work that Auntie Joy Murphy-Wandin, Uncle Dave Wandin and Brooke Wandin, all from the same family, have done and have led with us at the museum. These are situated practices, and it is an unfolding and never-ending process that by necessity is open to the complex and confronting geopolitical histories in our midst. And the projects have also helped shape my own learnings and imagination. So when I think back to how the museum was founded, it was founded by Eva and Mark Beeson in the spirit of gifting their collection of 20th and 21st century art as an offering. And in most cultures, an offering can generate an exchange of gifts and a chain of conversations, and there's reciprocity and there are friendships that continue and follow. And I think the generosity of spirit has permeated the projects from all of those involved. Museums are places of privilege, and historically they are keeping places for colonial theft of sacred objects. And today they can be a platform for the exchange of experiences that recognise the colonial devastation that is literally embedded in the soil beneath, thereby embarking on a process of healing for participants and audiences. And perhaps most importantly, the artists and the thinkers and the artworks in Untitled Seven Monuments, the Source Project, We Are Eagles, they're not contained by the museum, and they're certainly not owned by the museum. Instead, the museum is but one intersection point on a web of connections and exchanges and conversations, or what we call in Australia, yarns, and stories that exceed the museum and its programs, taking on a life embedded in the worlds that artists create. Thank you so much.
Victoria, you explained to us what country means as a concept, and you also hinted at certain ceremonies, etc. Can you please tell us a bit about the protocols that you are following at TarraWarra? For instance, if you go to Keen's website announcing this seminar, for the caption for Peter Clancy's work that you just saw in the presentation, there is also included something like published with the permission of so-and-so.
That's right. So for an Indigenous artist to come from another part of Australia, she needs to be welcomed onto the land by the traditional custodians of that land. So in order for Peter Clancy to do the project, she reached out to the Wurundjeri Council and the elders and sought their permission to do the project, which meant hours of discussion, explaining what she wanted to do, how she would do it, etc. And in addition to that, the location was in private hands. And so we had no access to that point in the confluence of these two rivers. So we had to contact the private landowner to get permission for Peter to go there several times, and that's the photo you saw all of us there. So if you think about it with Brooke Wandon, who's from that location, this was the first time in 100 years that someone from the Wurundjeri community had been on that land and could see the river from that perspective. Then, whenever we wanted to use soil from Wurundjeri country, we sought permission of the elders to use the soil. So it got quite granular because some of the artists coming from Indonesia wanted to use the soil from around the museum. So we do it out of a process of respect, to acknowledge that they are the traditional custodians of the land, and to acknowledge that that soil has been affected by the impact of colonisation on the land.
Were there some no's?
No, we've got a very good relationship with the Wurundjeri people, so there were no no's with this project, and I think the reason is because we brought them along from the very beginning. So from the very first discussions about what this project might be, they were at the table.
And can you also tell us a little bit about how it works with your exhibitions? I know because you told me that you often include an indigenous curator, even if that is not a person that was originally invited to curate an exhibition.
Yes, it's protocol in Australia that if you are going to do an exhibition with First Peoples artists in it from Australia, that you consult with other First Nations producers or artists or curators. And whenever a First Nations artist comes to TarraWarra, we organise a meeting for them with either Auntie Joy, Brooke Wandon or Uncle Dave or another elder in the community, so that there is this process of welcome as well. And I think that's getting more and more the case now in Australia, where First Nations content is designed, produced, curated by First Nations people.
And back to you, Nina. We're now speaking about protocols, working with contemporary art here. What are the obstacles?
I wouldn't necessarily call them obstacles. I think we often go into projects with an open mind, and of course you encounter obstacles along the way. But in truth, are they obstacles, or are they more things that we have to work through in a certain different way than maybe the normal way that we do things as a part of learning? And with the current permanent exhibition, for example, Design Stories, on the back of also acknowledging that we had very little Sami objects in our collection, it's not for us who necessarily don't have that knowledge and are not inhabiting that history to also know what is the best or the most important or relevant object or story to acquire to the collection. So we spent a bit of time to gather knowledge and search out the right people to speak to, who themselves have a Sami heritage and who can speak, of what that really would entail and what we need to consider to acquire a work of them as opposed to from a different background and so forth. So there are ways in which you can go about it, perhaps a little bit differently.
And can you go into a little bit more detail in terms of how did you identify those people and how did this consultation happen?
Well, we consulted Göteborg, who is a well-recognized scholar and also a maker, and who we contacted both to write for the catalogue, but also to consult her in what objects to acquire. And in that process, it wasn't sort of carte blanche, whatever you like. We were also sharing what we were trying to achieve with the exhibition that we did. And so it was a lot of back and forth in conversation, but also understanding. You become fairly humble in those processes because you also realize how little you actually know. At least speaking for myself in those situations, and you really try and tread fairly carefully as a way to be not just humble but also respectful towards a community or people with a history that you need to respect and be mindful and caring of. So this is just a small part of a much larger picture, of course, that we need to continue doing. But that's one example of that. And quickly, we also have Röhsska, the silversmith, in our collection, who not only was a silversmith with Roma heritage, but also as an activist. And we have had several pieces of her in the collection. And simultaneously, or a few years back, the Konsthalle here in Gothenburg had an exhibition with Mirka Tars, who'd already done a fantastic portrait of Rosa Taikon, making a piece of jewellery. And again, that kind of connection to an artist who can describe someone's practice better than words, perhaps, was also something that, for us, we would probably never have acquired that work of Mirka Tars had we not had Rosa Taikon in our collection. But that kind of way in which we bridge the arts, although we are a design and craft museum. And I think that is also interesting and important, that we are not shutting the doors, but rather at which point is it good and right and relevant to work with artists and in comparison to craftspeople and designers.
Thank you. Here I just have to add a footnote because you're mentioning Rosa Taikon. One of this year's museum highlights for me in Sweden is the new presentation of Rosa Taikon's work and her studio at Helsinglands Museum in Hudiksvall. It's such a great display and a wonderful narrative around Rosa's work and life. Don't miss it if you go north. And now back to you. Both of you now talking about protocols and procedures, backstage activities. How do you engage with the groups that you're talking about once something has been opened, it's there on display, it's out in the world?
Do you mean the groups that we've worked with to create it? Yeah. Obviously we do public programs, so they have the opportunity to speak to audiences and visitors once an exhibition or activity opens. We also ask them to write, and so we publish text by the artists and statements and observations. It is an interesting quandary that so much work goes into the research and the collaboration, and it's almost like when the exhibition opens, you've sort of cut that umbilical cord and then it's open to the public to interpret. But I also see that as a kind of gift to the public, that they can then take it in whatever direction and in whatever ways they want. But the artists have remained connected, and certainly some of them have remained friends, which is really beautiful. So yeah, it is a quandary though, yeah.
And here at Röhsska?
I would tend to agree, and I think where we've had the representation of, for example, Gunvor Guttorm's work, and it's not necessarily that we have hordes of Sami people coming here wanting to take part of that, and that's probably partly a communication thing from our side, more publicly, but also where we need to more consciously maybe work with that audience to make them even aware that it's here, and that we're also interested in their practice and their heritage to a larger degree than what we are today. But I think, like you say, there is something happening on backstage in a project, and once you release it, you hope sometimes only that they will see sight of it and be drawn. We give them an opportunity and a greater desire to come to us, to see themselves represented in some shape or form.
And we brought the Peter Clancy into the collection, so we've just put it up again for the current exhibition. And 2 of the Moliano paintings from the exhibition have gone into the Van Arby collection as well. So that gives things another life.
Now I would like to make a little turn back to what you were describing at the beginning of your presentation, Victoria, which is the origin of your museum, that it was founded by this couple, and there is still money coming from their family, and the implications of this for you in the context of Australia, and also the founders are Jewish, and we've had lots of discussions in different parts of the world in relation to the war and genocide in Gaza. Can you tell us a little bit about how this has worked at TarraWarra?
So Mark and Eva Beeson began collecting contemporary Australian art in 1952. They spent 7 decades collecting. They were completely dedicated to contemporary Australian art, which is now mostly modern art. They did collect some First Nations artists, but when the First Nations boom started in Australia in the 1980s, they'd already been collecting for 30 years. So they didn't really feel they needed to go in a new direction. They collected artists over many decades and supported their practice. They didn't have advisors. They always agreed on what they would require. And so 600 works have come to us. And they also supported the building itself. But they set the museum up as to not be individually owned. So we're a not-for-profit company limited by guarantee. We have an independent board of directors. And I and my staff have full authority about what we do in the museum, which has been terrific. And because I've come from the public sector, if you like, I've always run the museum as if we are a publicly funded art museum. Before he died, Mark died in November 2023, in 2018 he set up a foundation called the TarraWarra Museum Art Foundation, and that the interest from that foundation provides about 70% of our funding. So it doesn't really cover everything, but it covers mostly salaries and running costs. He also provided the funds to build the new building, although he didn't live to see it. And then we raise funds through government grants for special exhibitions. So for instance, our biennial attracts government grants, sponsorship, trusts and foundations, and we charge an entry fee, which gives us some money. All of that goes back into the programs and exhibitions that we do. So I would say we're not owned by an individual in the way that perhaps some other private museums in the world are. We're very unusual in Australia. Nobody else really set something up similar. There are other museums like Mona in Tasmania, but it is privately owned by David Walsh. White Rabbit in Sydney, privately owned by Judith Nielsen, who collects contemporary Chinese art and shows her collection. I'm reticent to talk about the situation at the moment because I think just because they're Jewish doesn't warrant a discussion necessarily, because to do that, in my mind, equates being Jewish with the terror that's happened in that region. But in terms of how our board has dealt with things, we were very much on the front foot. and we've had lots of internal discussions about freedom of expression, the rights of artists to their own cultural and political opinions, the right of the museum to show a diversity of perspectives, and certainly all the artists we show, particularly in our biennial, have very strong views about all kinds of things which they express through social media and the like. So I think we're living in a world now where we have to expect the unexpected culturally, and we haven't been affected. We have a very open policy, but there are other institutions in Australia where programs have been cancelled, which is very difficult for those involved.
You're, of course, absolutely right in terms of the founders being Jewish and the connection to Gaza. I'm mentioning it simply because I know that there have been some discussions in Australia and reactions.
They have, yeah.
So it did cause something that...
there is in Australia an enormous amount of support for Palestine. In Melbourne, there were weekly protests every Sunday for the entire duration of the war. We could talk about that. They've now ceased. There's enormous support in the art community for the Palestinian cause, and also in the First Nations community. I think the rejection of the voice happened just before October 7, and I think it was just a meeting of enormous amount of anger. And the social media campaign on both sides has been damaging for artists and has caused a great deal of distress. And unfortunately, there's a lot of black and white thinking, and I hope we can get past that and to a process of collaborative thinking and co-belonging. I think the way that we've worked with the trauma of First Nations people at TarraWarra can be a way forward for everyone to think about how to live alongside each other in this world.
Slowly and consistently. So Nina, I suspect that you have some questions for Victoria.
Well, yes, I think one of the things that, going back to sort of also what happens behind the scene, and you mentioned that you hired in external curators as First Nation curators and so forth, but I'm curious to know also what your staff not looks like physically, but in terms of representation, because that is one of the things that I think we also often talk about here in the Nordic region, is that if we are ever going to kind of succeed in broadening our perspectives and including more voices, it's really a tricky one when also the way in which we work in culture is very homogenous.
Yeah. We've engaged in what's called a Reconciliation Action Plan, which is a Reconciliation Australia process, and we've had 2 First Nations advisors to the museum for several years now. And it's a plan that's published, it's got a set of commitments, and the board like to see delivery against those commitments. And the processes of reconciliation that are embedded in it. So one of the plans is to bring on a First Nations curator, but we haven't got the finances to do that. So the way around it for the time being is to bring in guest curators to do these projects, which I have to say sometimes suits them because they're so busy and pulled in so many directions all the time. It would be difficult for them to commit to one institution. And next year we're going to do a whole seminar looking at Indigenous architecture and that is going to be convened by a First Nations architect with all Indigenous speakers, and we're also going to do a full day around Indigenous performance, and that's also going to be produced by a First Nations person. So First Nations run and thought through, and we step back because that's not our role. Yes, we're quite Anglo at TarraWarra, and it's not from not trying, but it's also always depends on who applies for roles and so on. But we're certainly extremely diverse in the projects and programs that we do.
And the two advisors you mentioned, how does that work?
So the RAP committee has a selection of staff on it, and we meet 3 times a year with the 2 advisors. So they advised us in how to write the RAP and what they thought would be correct protocol about what we wanted to do. And they had lots of fantastic ideas. And now they're working with us to monitor what we're doing. And if we have any questions that are quite tricky about how to proceed, we can reach out to them. And they get paid for that.
Can you please mention something that has changed or been added thanks to their involvement?
I think, oh gosh, there's so many things. I don't know one to choose. The employment of more First Nations people, so it could be photographers that come and document openings, First Nations products in the shop, First Nations suppliers, and of course a welcome to country to every exhibition, which we didn't used to do. We might do it for an Indigenous exhibition, but now we do it for every exhibition. So those are some of the things. I mean, for them, employment and remuneration for First Nations people is important.
And let's now turn the tables. What would your question for Nina be?
Well, I was very curious about the Chinese collection, and you mentioned to me that some research is being done on how those objects came into the collection, and that a researcher was trying to trace that journey. It was so long ago. So I just wondered what methodologies they're using to retrace that journey.
Well, there was a research journey made, I believe, about 15 to 18 years ago now, where a researcher and the photographer of the museum took their journey to China to re-step Wurundjeri-folkets' journey. And the background of this research trip was not only to kind of get a sense of what that journey looked like, but also to verify some of the content that we had back here from the early 1900s of his diaries, receipts of purchases and so forth, to really try and interrogate what was fiction and what was true. And through that they were able to put a book together for both the sort of the photographic journey, but also to verify some of the proofs or the lack of proofs. So I guess it culminates in a very interesting book, but there are still a lot of questions that aren't yet answered. But I guess that's also kind of the challenge with a lot of those old collections that end up in European museums, and you really need to dedicate time and staff to get to the bottom of it. So for us, it's been something that we definitely could spend a lot more time researching and investigating, and to mediate it satisfactorily enough during just now, but maybe not for the future, is that it's also how you present a collection, it's also how you use interpretation, it's what you present and how frank you talk about the past. And I think that is only the starting point in being more transparent about where things come from and the past of collecting it and how we go about it today. So there is no perfect answer, and Röhsska is not perfect in that way either, but I think it's those slow curating in slow steps that will take us forward, but it's something that we have to be conscious of and responsible for.
And it's
Always.
Never complete.
No.
And,
But I guess that's the challenge. It can so quickly be understood as an excuse of not dealing with stuff, and I think sometimes that can also be true. But in the scheme of things, of all the things that the museum is made up of and has to work with, it's different priorities, and sometimes we don't always get those priorities right either, or we wish to do something, other things lead us in a different direction. And that also is probably what makes it different to be in a private foundation, or you're being governed politically. All those things also matter in the way in which you run and work with a museum, but it never takes away the history of the collection. Should be on par regardless of what type of museum you are.
So now comes your moment for questions and thoughts. I will move down with the mic so that also we can get a recording of what is being said. Who is the icebreaker?
Thank you. Thank you, Victoria, for your wonderful talk, and thanks for a great conversation too. I will take the opportunity to be the icebreaker. Maria, thank you. I'm also kind of returning back maybe to the beginning of your presentation when you spoke about language and there being 38 regional languages. Maybe Victoria can extend how you work with language, because in your presentation you use the terms project, exhibition, curating, the museum, collecting. I wonder how you're working with language also to kind of challenge those frames and those terms.
That's a great question. First on the 38 languages, most of them have been lost, and Brooke is a language educator and has been researching Wurundjeri, and she now teaches it at the local primary school. And we've recently produced a resource for children that identifies the garden and the plants in it that we've created in English language and Wurundjeri. So she's also done a kind of workshop with the staff to start to teach us some of the Wurundjeri words. If I use Wurundjeri, I have to, in a sense, get her permission. I can say Wurundjeri, which means come with purpose or welcome. So in terms of the Wurundjeri language, it's a very delicate situation, but we're really pleased to have produced that resource, and we did it with Brooke and Craig Wandon, and Craig is the person who did the garden. You're right, it's the soils was really a project, and as an exhibition it probably looked a bit incomplete because it was so research based, and maybe not everybody gets that, but the people who do really appreciated it. I think there's different publics for different kinds of things. And I would say that with the Soils project, we didn't curate as such, we facilitated, and it was an experiment at so many levels, and it also meant that as a first world institution, we needed to be aware of our privilege. So one of the things we did when we brought these different community groups onto the project, we didn't call them artists, we called them fellow travellers in the journey. The Indonesians suggested that
those communities be paid at the same rate as what the first world community and artists were being paid in the Netherlands and Australia, and we did that. And we also didn't insist on an outcome, which is hard for a museum, because when you commission an artist to do something, you expect an outcome. But we said to the two communities, just use the money in a way that will help you. So one of them set up a temporary school for girls, and we're talking 5,000 Australian dollars. It's not very much money in the scheme of things. And they were thrilled with that. So that project really did ask us to use language in a different way, definitely. The museum was called upon to be much more self-reflexive about its history and its modernist entity as being part of modernism is part of that colonial journey. So, yeah.
And I'm looking around, seeing a hand here.
Thank you very much for this presentation, lovely. I was wondering, the concept of co-belonging, which I found very interesting. For me, it was acknowledging both a divided past, but also aiming for a shared future. That's what I read into it. And I was wondering if it's a shared understanding, or if it's also a contested concept in terms of right to interpretation, the First Nations right to land, etc. Can you please tell me more?
Yeah, I think it's important that the contest of ideas remains. So it is a notion that acknowledges a montage of relations where there are different points of view. Now, of course, I share the points of view of the Wurundjeri people, but not everybody would understand their points of view. And in Australia, the art world obviously is very sympathetic, but there might be general public who aren't. And we've seen the increase of racism right around the world. So I just would like to work in a gesture of hope and positivity, and we could not have done Soils without the sort of 10 years of work I did before that with the Wandering Estate. You have to earn trust, and it took years for them to even come into the museum. So these are very long-term projects.
Here we have one more.
Hi, thank you for this conversation and presentation. I think this is a question even for Maria Lynn, since you three representing like 3 different institutions. So my question is, you have been talking about collaborations. My question is, how do you view notions of transparency and opacity? I'm thinking about, Edward Lizal was talking about the right to opacity when talking about this handling knowledge that is so vulnerable and also so fragile, because you're handling a knowledge that belongs to the First Nation communities, belongs to Sami indigenous communities. So how do you protect their right to opacity, and do you think you have the right to opacity as an institution as well? Thanks.
Great question. So maybe I will just start by saying that the right to opacity is key. We live in a time where there is a dogma around transparency. Certainly transparency is important, and it is part of democracy and equality, etc. But we also need to question some of the ways in which it is being used right now. And there's a whole field, academic field called transparency studies that can provide multiple angles on complications and moments when it's maybe not so motivated. So in terms of the King Museum of Contemporary Art, where I'm working now, and in general in my practice, I think the right to opacity should be an option, but you have to think about when and where to claim it. So I don't think there is a general rule, but a bit like Victoria explained, it's about being sensitive to the situation and to the context. And certainly in relation to indigenous people and communities, it has to always be ready, so to speak, if that is what they wish.
I think where we work less with indigenous people, I think in terms of transparency, my experience is not that transparency doesn't necessarily have to be so complicated. I think with transparency comes also this humbleness and building trust in order to be transparent. And I think in those relationships, in building relationships with different communities, and certainly in light of the different collections that we have at Röhsska, that transparency is key to build trust. But also what you said, you have to kind of, when is it right to be transparent and when is it right to claim opacity? And I think those situations you have to address at different times. But I would definitely say that transparency is one of those things that I think often is perceived as institutions are not. And I think if you're going to sort of build trust over time, you have to also be ready to be potentially slightly more transparent than we are normally.
I think that the First Nations communities and artists that we work with have the right to opacity, and it's their call on when they want that opacity to be in place or not. And I feel like museums need to be more transparent about everything, the collections, the funding, the strategies, strategic plans, the policies, and that's certainly the case with the way things are now with TarraWarra. So we would work very closely with, say, a guest curator, explaining where we're coming from, where they're coming from. We have a long contract of what we agree to do, what they agree to do. We have policies which we're transparent about. And then I really, even if I'm not curating the show, I like to be able to work closely with the artists as well, just to get to know them and understand where they're coming from and what they want to make. It's not always possible, but I think it's important to make them feel welcome.
So it's time to wrap up. On the note of transparency, personally, I often long for more narratives from museums. And I think if there were more narratives where museums could elaborate on why they're doing what they're doing and what the choices in terms of methodology, even artistic positions are, then there would be a greater sense of transparency. And with that being said, you've been super transparent, Victoria. Thank you so much. Thank you also, Nina and Röhsska, for hosting this event. Thank you, Gunnar and Sveriges Museer. And not least, thank all of you for coming. And now we will have some snacks afterwards.
Yes. And I would like to also take the opportunity to thank you, Maria and Gunnar. It's not so often we get to collaborate in this fashion with Sveriges Museer, and it's been a great privilege to both plan it and to work with you. So more of this. Thank you, and thanks everyone for coming.